here you have many of these Arab leaders. They say they don't like the Muslim movement. They say they don't like Islamicists, for example, so called. But then they contribute to the destabilization of al Assad in Damascus, bringing rebranded Al Qaeda and rebranded ISIS into power, although they said they don't like these sorts of figures. So you wonder, do these people really know what they're doing?
And
It's the same thing on this side of the Atlantic with many of the liberals, for example. Uh, they're not moving necessarily to a deeper analysis of how we got into this pickle. They're just angry at Trump. And they just feel that Trump is the problem, not historical forces, not the Red Scare, not class collaboration, not racism and white supremacy. Uh, it's Trump,
exactly.
except that they're not able to explain how and why it is that he got 77 million votes November 5th, 2024, that it would be mathematically imprecise to suggest that in a nation of 330 million, those votes all came from the 1% that control the commanding heights of the economy, or why it is today that despite getting only 49% of the popular vote, according to polls, his popularity rating is above 50%. But I should have been adding a major footnote, which is that you should not be surprised if on May 9th, 2025, the holiest day on the Russian calendar, marking the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism, if on the podium at the rostrum are not only Putin and Xi, because of course the purpose of making a deal with Russia was to do a reverse Nixon, that is to say, to win Russia over to an anti-China posture, which is apparently another fool's errand. But don't be surprised if Trump is on the roster as well. That is to say, cutting deals of various levels with both Russia and China, and to get them frozen in place as Canada and the European Union are plucked. Now, that may sound a bit overly overwrought, for example, but as I skim the headlines, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility.
I wanted to ask, like, I'm having trouble putting this in a pithy question because there's so many things have happened even just over the past week that I'd like to ask you about, but including, the Europeans, as you mentioned, are having a nervous breakdown. They're finally beginning to question their whole Maastricht Treaty 3% limitation, 3% of GDP and deficit spending limitation, which in effect basically says private banks are the only ones that can create money for investment. Governments can't do that. You had the Mario Draghi report that came out a few months ago that said, yeah, we massively need more government investment, but they're only now talking about getting rid of that spending restriction to spend more on killing machines. So you've got that development. You've got Trump negotiating with Russia to end the Ukraine war. You've got Trump's insane idea to create the Hong Kong of the Middle East. This was from a Times article where they found some Israeli American academic wrote a report suggesting this idea, and it was sent to the White House. And it seems like Trump is just reading directly from this idea. And it's like, we'll do a 50 years of sovereignty basically given over to private investors, and then we'll turn it over to the people who live there. But of course, Trump's idea is to expel all the Palestinians. That's just a non-starter. It's not going to happen. But what will happen is very much up in the air. And I'm wondering, I'm sorry, this is such a wide-ranging question, but if you could try to just, provide your perspective on all of the insanity, not all of the insanity, but some of the most prominent examples of insanity that have popped up over the past week or so.
Well, when Trump had his press conference at the White House with Netanyahu by his side, Netanyahu said that with regard to this Mediterranean Riviera known as Gaza today, Netanyahu said this is out of the box thinking. Well, the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman said it's out of your mind thinking. However, I do think it may be an example of the art of the deal. I mean, you never know with Trump. It's almost like a mug's game to try to get in his head. But it does seem as if this gambit that he often does, which is raise some outrageous proposal, and that gets the chickens running around with their heads cut off. For example, now there is this Egyptian billionaire, the Trump of Egypt, talking about organizing a syndicate of Gulf Arab money to pour into Gaza right now as a way to circumvent the Trump plan of ethnic cleansing. And so perhaps this is what was intended. I mean, who knows? But certainly, this kind of provocation, I think, in the long term, is contrary to the long-term interests of U.S. imperialism because nations do not necessarily forget this sort of thing. It's just like Trump's gambit in Southern Africa, castigating the African National Congress government, saying, going along with this idea that there's a genocide against the European minority, and now the right wing of that minority is rallying, for example, which is going to make them more untrustworthy to the Black majority, for example. That's really going to be the long-term consequence. But it's an example of settler solidarity. But once again, since on the US left, we're not using the vocabulary of settler colonialism, it's hard to see that basic reality. And then in Southern Africa, it'll have knock-on effects because you had racist regimes, not only in South Africa, but across the border in Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, across that border in Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, to the west in former German Southwest Africa, Namibia, where the first genocide of the 20th century took place against the Herero and the Nama in 1904 to 1908. Even in the former Portuguese colonies like Mozambique and Angola, on each side of Southern Africa, you have still substantial European populations. And speaking of European populations, I was listening to a Chinese lecturer on YouTube today, and he was really denigrating the long-term probabilities and possibilities of the European Union. He says that there are two kinds of European nations. There are small nations and nations that don't understand that they're small nations. And I guess in the latter category, you can include Britain, France,
Netherlands.
Netherlands for sure, for example. And given the fact that Trump is trying to disrupt the European Union, uh, dealing with these nations one on one, having allies in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, having allies in Hungary, about to gain other allies that will then stand strong against France. The prospects for Europe don't look very good right now, which is understandable. It's understandable why they're having a collective nervous breakdown. I mean, it's a rational response.
Did you see that European politician? I think he was German crying. Have you seen the crying guy?
No, who is this? Harbeck?
Who was that, Peter?
No, I forget. I think it was like the chairman of the Munich Security Conference. I'm not sure.
Or Boris
Oh,
Pistorius, the Minister of Defense? He was really angry with J.D. Vance.
That might
yeah,
have
well, he
been.
was crying. He was literally crying because he saw the end of the shared values between the United States and Europe. It was so pathetic, and it was so typical of the state Europe was in. It was like the perfect parallel. I mean, they're like a crybaby about the values of Europe and America. Oh my God. Yeah. What
The,
can
the
I say?
garden in America is turning into a jungle.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Shared values of democracy and freedom, and now we have Trump. Oh no!
Mm-hmm.
It's
I
it's
mean,
and
it's the same thing on this side of the Atlantic with many of the liberals, for example. Uh, they're not moving necessarily to a deeper analysis of how we got into this pickle. They're just angry at Trump. And they just feel that Trump is the problem, not historical forces, not the Red Scare, not class collaboration, not racism and white supremacy. Uh, it's Trump,
exactly
except that they're not able to explain how and why it is that he got 77 million votes November 5th, 2024, that it would be mathematically imprecise to suggest that in a nation of 330 million, those votes all came from the 1% that control the commanding heights of the economy, or why it is today that despite getting only 49% of the popular vote, according to polls, his popularity rating is above 50%. Now, actually, I find that a head scratcher, given all the damage that he's doing. But once again, a lot of the damage has not necessarily percolated down to the MAGA grassroots. Even though in West Texas, you now have a measles epidemic, planes are falling out of the sky. I mean, as a person who flies quite a bit, I mean, I get, the right wing, the right wing says when they get on a plane and see a black pilot, they get nervous because they feel he's a DEI hire, he's a diversity hire, and won't know how to fly the plane. I get nervous when I get on the plane because I think that there's layoffs in the aircraft traffic control tower, and that this overworked air traffic controller will have two planes collide, or a helicopter and a plane collide, which happened in Washington just when I was there in Washington when that happened, for example. So despite all these catastrophes, and we're just in the foothills of this Trump regime, there's 4 more years of this madness, which is difficult to contemplate.
Yeah, and when I saw that guy crying, I was thinking about the discussion we also had with Matt Kennard, the journalist from the UK, where he believed that many of these politicians, but also journalists, really believe in the things they say, instead of that it's malicious intent. And
Mm-hmm.
I agree, a lot of them do really believe in what they say, but I also think there's a lot of malicious intent. But when I saw that guy crying, I realized there's just this huge segment of the political class in Europe, but also in the United States, that are at the highest levels. Let's say Mark Rutte from the Netherlands, who is now the head of NATO, who really believe in this stuff. We're having people who are literally having their hands on the buttons of the most powerful weapons and invasions and everything, the decisions to invade and all these kind, who seriously believe that they are leading a world where they have shared values with the United States rooted in democracy and freedom. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
unbelievable. These guys are deciding based on life and death.
Grown ass adults.
Grown as
Well,
adults, indeed.
I'm self-critical because I think that as a person who's oftentimes speaking, I should have been stressing more what I've just sketched and outlined, which is that the Trump team would turn on Canada and the European Union. I mean, I mentioned it intermittently, but it wasn't the major theme. As a matter of fact, heavily my theme was that the Biden wing of the ruling class was on a fool's errand trying to undermine Russia and China simultaneously. Trump is going to cut a deal with Russia to focus on China. But I should have been adding a major footnote, which is that you should not be surprised if on May 9th, 2025, the holiest day on the Russian calendar, marking the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism, if on the podium at the rostrum are not only Putin and Xi, because of course the purpose of making a deal with Russia was to do a reverse Nixon, that is to say, to win Russia over to an anti-China posture, which is apparently another fool's errand. But don't be surprised if Trump is on the roster as well. That is to say, cutting deals of various levels with both Russia and China, and to get them frozen in place as Canada and the European Union are plucked. Now, that may sound a bit overly overwrought, for example, but as I skim the headlines, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility.
I would be so amused and happy to see that. I would die laughing, perhaps. Yeah, that's actually that reverse Kissinger was one thing I was trying to stuff into that omnibus question earlier.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard that, somebody was saying that Putin is too ideological to fall for that. I'm not so sure, but on the other hand, because he said that the U.S. is not agreement capable, I also find it hard to believe that he would go for that sort of a reverse Kissinger approach or deal simply because in 3 4 years, God knows what the U.S. is who is going to be leading the U.S. and whether they would follow through on that deal.
Of
But
course.
yeah, but I don't know. What do you think what should we be looking for in this? Because Trump makes so many noises emanate from his mouth, and you have no idea whether they have any connection to reality whatsoever. Um, what would you be looking for in the next, I don't know, half a year of U.S. foreign policy with regard to Russia, China, Europe, and West Asia?
Well, as I say, I see Canada as a demonstration project. Is very vulnerable. I mean, the fifth or sixth largest economy, according to Ottawa, on planet Earth. It's depleted its military by sending its weapons disproportionately to Ukraine, for example. It really has no military answer to the United States, although I don't necessarily contemplate a U.S. military invasion. But as Mr. Trump himself said, it's economic force, for example. Uh, the impact of tariffs, the fact that so many, particularly in the prairie provinces like Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, are pro-Yankee and will be willing to play the role of Quisling, for example. And if you're able to successfully destabilize Canada, that makes it easier to go after the Netherlands, for example, which is much smaller and of course, also has Quislings abounding in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, The Hague, for example. So I find this so perverse and ironic. I mean, after 500 years of Western European ascendancy, for many of these nations to be in the position of becoming neo-colonial appendages, or some would say more obvious neo-colonial appendages, because of course they've been playing that de facto role for years now.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. So the white supremacist empire is finally cannibalizing itself. I was just thinking, and people people have been warning for that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, may it happen quickly. Um,
Yeah.
I I'm curious to hear your thought. There's one thing that I recognize that it's unlikely, but it would be a positive outcome. So I very much hope that things move in this direction. But when it comes to Trump's insane plan of owning Gaza, redeveloping it, ethnically cleansing it, etc., there have been some very clear repudiations of that idea coming from the US's client regimes all throughout West Asia. What do you think the chances are that pressure from those client regimes, basically telling Trump that, we love your idea, it's great, we don't give a shit about the Palestinians either, but our population sadly does, and we would get killed if we went along with this, so therefore we can't go along with this. There will have to be no ethnic cleansing simply because we would get overthrown and we'd end up like Mussolini or what have you. Do you think that that's a viable, a possible future that we might be heading toward, where simply the popular pressure on the client regimes of the region forces the Trump administration to back away from the ethnic cleansing plan and actually keep the Palestinians there in their land? Whereas that just wishful thinking on my part.
Well, no, I don't think it's wishful thinking. I mean, you'll need look no further than the squirming of the King of Jordan when he was in the Oval Office with Trump just a week or so ago. Of course, his population is heavily Palestinian. He's married to a Palestinian woman, the Queen, and he was tap dancing and moonwalking and dodging, seeking to avoid either contradicting Trump or making a clear and convincing statement. Say, stay tuned for the Arab League meeting at the end of February, for example. That was his mantra.
Squinting his eyes like he is a dead man walking.
And of course, there is leverage because you know that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto Saudi leader, He said in the next few years he's going to invest $600 billion in the United States of America. And he, as well as other Arab leaders, have to be alert to what happened to Anwar Sadat, who, of course, his assassination was captured on camera. You can see it on YouTube, for example. They all have to worry about that sort of thing. But sometimes I wonder, just like I'm wondering about Canada. You have a foreign ministry and the think tanks, and you didn't see coming what Mr. Trump had in store. I mean, perhaps they should be sacked and fired. Perhaps they should be forced to engage in harikari, uh, as would happen perhaps in Japan. I mean, here you have many of these Arab leaders. They say they don't like the Muslim League. They say they don't like Islamicists, for example, so-called. But then they contribute to the destabilization of al-Assad in Damascus, bringing rebranded al-Qaeda and rebranded ISIS into power, although they said they don't like these sorts of figures. So you wonder, do these people really know what they're doing? I mean, or is it too much to expect consistency from them?
Well, that's the kind of Islam that they like. I mean, another guest of ours, Laith Marouf, always said that the West actually likes the stereotypical Hollywood Arab because that's the Hollywood Arab that not only helps imperialism fight their wars, but also creates that image that primes Islamophobia that also supports imperialism because then the local population in the West supports imperialism against those so-called savages. So I always say that the Hollywood stereotype of Muslims like those HTS people in Syria that's the kind of Muslim the ruling classes like in the United States and the West in general.
Well, I can see that in the United States, but what about in Riyadh?
Yeah.
One person's view of that was it's kind of like it's like getting rid of your surplus population, the young angry men that might otherwise overthrow your regime. You export them elsewhere so that they cause mayhem elsewhere, but they don't cause any trouble at home.
I see. Well, but what happens when in December 2024 they triumph and that now they've been trained and perhaps they want to go back home to see their families?
Well, people don't seem to give a lot of thought to blowback, and
Oh, I see. Well, it's short-term thinking. I mean, it's just like when the United States cut the deal with China. The short-term thinking was do everything possible to destabilize the Soviet Union, and we're worried about the consequences later. You know.
yeah, exactly. Oh, Kareem, you're muted.
Same with Riyadh, I guess. There seem to be short-term benefits to supporting U.S. imperialism and the support of these crazies in Syria. But yeah, what can we say?
Mhm.
Um, and I've seen you do quite a few updates lately about the things that are going on in this world, and what I like about your updates about the current state of affairs is that you often talk about settler solidarity. You
Mhm.
talk about how important a race and a colonial analysis is to understand the state of the world today, our political systems, imperialism, etc. And I think this stays a very important discussion that just doesn't get a lot of attention among in anti-imperialist and leftist spheres that are Western most of the time, are often white and Western, the same usual suspects that get invited over and over and over again. And most programs usually just don't do a racial analysis and mostly want to focus on the class analysis. So my question is, um, why in the world that we see today, from Donald Trump to Palestine to imperialism in general, why is it so important to refrain from this idea that we should step beyond an analysis of race and focus mostly on class? I say this because I was baffled by a program that I saw a while ago, it was of DiEM25. DiEM25 is a party of Yanis Varoufakis in Europe, a leftist party, and one of the major members of DiEM25 asked a guest, "So, can we safely say that we are now finally uh, uh, post the time that we focus on race and we can finally focus on class?" And I was very disturbed by that question because I immediately thought about you, Professor Horne, that a class analysis excluding race is not very useful. Now, before I'm going to talk too much, can you enlighten us a bit on this topic, Professor Horne?
Well, I think the problem with that sort of analysis, and let's start with North America, although I dare say that my words can go beyond the borders of this so-called republic, that when you talk about race in the United States of America, oftentimes you're really talking about a degraded sector of the working class. For example, pre-1865, you're talking about an unpaid sector of the working class, otherwise known as the enslaved. And then post-1865, you're talking about a degraded sector of the working class, just as in 2025, a degraded sector of the working class is disproportionately comprised of those of Mexican origin, for example. So that's why this attempt to juxtapose race and class is so baffling and so misleading, when actually you're just talking about different sectors of the working class. And this, of course, ties into another phrase that you used in your opening remarks, which is settler colonialism. That is to say, that sadly, tragically, and unfortunately, oftentimes in the United States of America, there's no recognition of the fact that this was a settler colonial society, not unlike Israel or South Africa, Southern Africa, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, New Zealand, Australia, Kenya, Algeria. The list is long. And with regard to settler colonialism, particularly in the areas that I know best, speaking of the regimes in North America and in Africa, although I dare say it's applicable to a certain degree in the Pacific as well, with regard to Australia and New Zealand, is that these societies were constructed on the basis of class collaboration. For example, in my book on the 16th century, I point out that when the English invaded what they call North Carolina in the 1580s, it was a heterogeneous class mixture of declassed elements, shopkeepers, working class elements, et cetera, all sponsored by the 1%, all determined to uproot the indigenous, seize their land, and with luck and pluck, get enslaved Africans dragged across the Atlantic, kicking and screaming to work for free. And this failure to understand settler colonialism leads to related misunderstandings of other questions. I mean, for example, when I was in graduate school, I can't tell you the times that I was instructed by my professors that the fact that the Jewish minority received a better shake in North America as opposed to Europe was a reflection of Enlightenment values in the United States of America, and the United States being more progressive. Whereas, as I point out in my book on Southern California, recently published last year, one of the first settlers in what is now San Diego, California, Dandy San Diego, was a Jewish man who had a reputation as an Indian fighter. That is to say, that the mission accomplished, or that Jewish folk were able to accomplish on this side of the Atlantic, was different from their role in Western Europe. I mean, if you look at the history of the Jewish minority in North America, many of them played pivotal roles in terms of enslavement, for example. Those of you who are familiar with U.S. football may be familiar with the running back Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens from Yulee, Florida, Yulee. Senator Yulee, of course, was a Jewish American legislator and pro-slavery element from the Sunshine State, the number 2 leader in the Confederate States of America that seceded from the United States in order to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore was Judah P. Benjamin, who happened to be Jewish, of course, and wound up fleeing to Europe after his secessionist project was defeated. And so there's this abject failure, A, to recognize settler colonialism and all that that entails, not least class collaboration, which then leads to misunderstanding the class question in general, leading to this wrong-headed juxtaposition of race and class. And in fact, it's deeper than that, because as you probably know, in the United States right now, the tangerine tyrant has made a top priority of overturning so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, to use the acronym. Now, what's interesting is that his platform reflects class politics. That is to say, when he seeks to overturn the Consumer Protection Finance Bureau, which monitors the banking and loan shark industries and has returned $20 billion, oftentimes to the pockets of Trump supporters in the working class and middle class, the 1% is overjoyed. They're dancing in the streets, for example. And when there's an overturning of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, the working class base, oftentimes these mediocre elements, they feel that as a result, they'll get a better shape in terms of competition for promotions and hiring with regard to non-minority women and with regard to people of color generally. That may be true, it may not be true. But here's the thing. You have certain liberal and social democratic elements in the United States of America who are applauding the overturning of DEI because, once again, it's a misinterpretation of the class question. From their point of view, DEI disrupts class solidarity, for example, that it disrupts the class struggle. What they don't realize is that DEI disrupts class collaboration. It disrupts this very neat alliance between poor and working class settlers and affluent settlers. For example, when you had the construction trades, which were flexing their muscles in the 1970s in Manhattan when Donald J. Trump was surging to preeminence as a real estate speculator, the construction trades oftentimes had clauses in their charters that were white-only clauses. And therefore, you had Black organizations that engaged in sit-down strikes with the construction of skyscrapers until Black workers were hired. And so that form of diversity, it was helping to desegregate otherwise racist unions, or once again, to return to professional football. If you watched the Super Bowl, you might have noticed that there was a disproportionate number of Black Americans on the field. And of course, the criteria for getting those jobs, oftentimes they're objective criteria. Either you can run 40 yards in 4.1 seconds or you can't. Either you can jerk and lift 500 pounds of weights or you can't. With regard to the coaching staff, for example, that's heavily non-Black because, of course, it's based on subjective hiring criteria. Your leadership ability, I'm not sure what the metric is for that, your ability to motivate players. And so what's happened is that the players' union has struggled to have criteria that would allow for the hiring of more coaches. And so they force these conservative capitalist owners to institute rules that say, if you're going to hire for coaches, you have to have a diverse pool. In other words, that was not a gift from the conservative capitalists. It was a democratic demand from the players' union, for example. And you have other forces on the left who say the DEI is liberal counterinsurgency. It's some sort of attempt, once again, to disrupt class struggle. To disrupt class struggle, when actually it's disrupting class collaboration. And so this kind of misunderstanding, miscomprehension is rather endemic in this country right now. As noted, the people I'm talking about, oftentimes they're liberals and social democrats, self-professed socialists, for example. I guess they don't recognize the alternative to DEI or lily white workplaces. Perhaps they do realize it. Perhaps that's why they're in favor of it. to be sure. But in any case, if they're going to object to DEI, they should object to the profiteering of Don Jr., Eric, and Ivanka Trump. That's the DEI they should be objecting to, not diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is really a step forward to a just society. It's not a disruption of class struggle as so many people wrong in a wrong-headed fashion uh, assert.
Hmm. I've you made me think of a superficial question and then a question that is perhaps a little more interesting. One, I remember reading about I think her name was Lucy Parsons, a
Mm-hmm.
communist from the 1920s, 1930s. I read about her in a book by Angela Davis. It was a chapter on communist women in the U.S. And if I'm remembering correctly, Parsons' view is that race and even sex are kind of like subcategories of class. They're like super exploited classes within the working class. Is that, first of all, if that characterization is accurate, is that similar to what you're arguing here? And then just one football question. I was listening to Inside the NFL this season, and they were talking about this cornerback, I think for the Eagles, who's white, and they were saying, this guy's like the Rosa Parks of cornerbacks, and and it made me think, we understand why there haven't been many black quarterbacks in the NFL because the coaches just think, oh, this guy's black, so he can't be, a leader and he's not intellectual enough, blah, blah, blah. And I wonder if you think racism works the other way as well, in that these coaches early on, they say, okay, I need a defensive player. I need them to be mean and scary. And of course, that fits in with their racist stereotype of black players. So they're more likely to pick black players to play cornerback. But anyway, you can feel free to skip the football question. I'm just curious now that the season's over, sadly, so I'd like to talk about it. But also the Lucy Parsons question. I'm interested to hear your
Mm-hmm.
thoughts.
Well, with regard to the former, I think that the structure and the superstructure, if I can use those antiquated phrasings, should not necessarily be conflated uh, or conjoined. What I mean is, it is true that, for example, the essence of racism involves class exploitation, but that does not denigrate the point that in order to get society to go along with this class exploitation and to see it as normalized, for example, to have even immigrant groups come to the United States and recognize or seek to recognize that there's something scary about going into a Black community. That's part of the superstructure of racism, for example, which helps to undergird this class exploitation and undergird this idea that these people deserve to be second and third class citizens because they come from inferior stock, so to speak. So there's this sort of interrelationship between the two. When I was beginning, I was just trying to acknowledge that this question of racism oftentimes involves super exploitation. It oftentimes involves super profiteering, but at the same time, it involves certain kinds of psychological understandings as well, certain kinds of social understandings as well, uh, that help to then undergird and underpin this class exploitation. Now, with regard to the second point, there may be something to that. To be frank, I hadn't thought about it that much. I do know that in sports in the United States, in particular, because of the heavy domination in basketball and football in particular, that these conservative capitalist owners, they're oftentimes looking for melanin deficient players, for example, because they feel that given the audience, I mean, if you're playing in Salt Lake City, Utah, the Utah Jazz basketball team, and the audience is monochromatic and they sometimes it's conservative and it's felt that if they have players on the court who look like folks in the stands, that they'll be more likely to come to the game. So that has been my understanding of how the inverse of this race question. Now, with regard to the point that you make, I could see that operative in WWE, World Wrestling, for example, which plays heavily on racist tropes, for example. Not only anti-black racist tropes, but anti-Arab racist tropes, anti-Persian racist, anti-Iranian racist tropes, for example, in terms of who is considered to be the villain, for example, because then that taps into something that's certain folks in the audience can resonate with. Uh, for example, during the so-called hostage crisis of the late 1970s, for example, you had a proliferation of anti-Persian villains in professional wrestling, for example. Now, with regard to the so-called legitimate sports, where at least we are led to believe that the fix is not in and that these are legitimate contests, uh, once again, I point to my example of the Utah Jazz. And actually, if I were to do a drill down on the lack of success of the Utah Jazz in recent years, it's probably because of that reverse kind of affirmative action, where they're trying to attract players who resemble the people in the stands, but then they're not necessarily good players.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
The that comment about the fix perhaps being in is that perhaps because you're a Texans fan?
Well, no, it's just that, I know enough about the history to know about gambling. I mean, there's a scandal waiting to explode in
Mm.
this country concerning the proliferation of gambling, for example. I mean, in the United States right now, you can bet on just about anything. You can bet upon if the player is going to hit the next free throw, if he's going to miss the next free throw, if a referee is going to give a player a technical foul. And not coincidentally, you've had scandals about referees being on the tape. You've
Mm.
had players being suspended and investigated. The most recent one being Jonte Porter of the Toronto Raptors, for example, Terry Rozier of the Miami Heat, for example. There are probably many more. Recall that in the early 1950s, when gambling was not as prevalent as it is today, you had college basketball games that were being fixed on a mass basis and players being being caught and suspended, etc. And then, of course, to bring it back to politics, well, actually, that's political, but to bring it more overtly back to politics, you know that Miriam Adelson, a major supporter of both Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald J. Trump, who, of course, has interests in Macau. As a matter of fact, some of her cash cows are in Macau, but she also has interests in Las Vegas and is now bought into the Dallas Mavericks basketball team, which, of course, just traded their star player, a generational talent, 25-year-old Luka Doncic of the Dallas Mavericks, traded to the LA Lakers. Now, I read an article the other day trying to connect what some have said to be a lopsided trade to gambling interests. Now, before you get sued, I'm not sure if that's accurate, but it's that kind of thinking right now that's percolating with regard to sports fans.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I'd like to get it back a bit to again to that whole class race issue. So it seems, and you also often highlight that an only class analysis is just also not sufficient because um, every single time when things get tough, you see that cross-class collaboration where the white working class will often vote for white billionaires. So you can say instead of choosing class solidarity with their fellow class brothers and sisters of different ethnicities, they choose to vote for white billionaires of a completely different class. But the linkage, you could say, is a kind of race solidarity. My question is, you often say our friends on the left don't do an analysis of colonialism and racism. What would be a good way? Because we are now already in 2025 and the problem keeps repeating also in Europe. Like people just vote based on racist grounds and against their own class interests. How can we convince our friends on the left to make racism and colonialism as a central component to the class question more important? How can we convince also people in the anti-imperialist sphere, especially on the Western anti-imperialist sphere, to embrace a racial analysis? Well, what would you advise, Professor Horne? Because this often stays in a very intellectual realm, and they don't seem to be interested in that somehow. I'm just wondering, like, what can we do?
That's a good question. I mean, if I had a definitive answer, uh, I'd probably bottle it and make a billion that I could then use to subsidize anti-imperialism. But certainly this kind of discussion is a step in that direction. You know that oftentimes cite the example of the US Civil War, where the foot soldiers of the Confederate States of America, which had seceded from the United States in order to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore, were heavily and disproportionately comprised of poor and working class and middle class white men who were fighting to ensure that enslaved Africans would undercut their wage level and the working conditions that they had to endure, not to mention ultimately replacing them. Because just as today, Mark Anderson, who is a titan of Silicon Valley, says he's in favor of artificial intelligence because it's going to crush wages, for example. In 1865, you could have said, well, I'm in favor of slavery of Africans because it'll crush wages, for example. So that's a clear example of some apparently fighting against their class interests. But I say apparently because it reminds me of the stories I used to read when I was a kid. I assume this is the case, where the way you got a donkey to pull a cart was to put a carrot on the end of the stick. And the donkey was always grasping to try to take a bite out of the carrot, never got it, but it would pull the cart along. And so many of these workers in Dixie, in the Confederate States of America, they thought that if they were on the winning side of the US Civil War, that they were not undercutting their wages. They were creating the possibility that they could have an African working for them for free, for example, that they could become a slave owner. It's like the lottery. And once again, we're back to gambling. I mean, the lotteries are a multi-billion-dollar business in the United States, perhaps worldwide. And obviously, it's based upon a skewed, flawed premise. That is to say that you contribute a small amount and you wake up the next morning a billionaire. And it was that kind of psychological thinking that was driving these elements who had signed up for the Confederate States of America. And it's still operative today. I mean, for example, in Washington, D.C., my friends tell me that for the first time, they've seen at demonstrations these Euro-American men in bespoke suits and ties protesting, for example, because you've had mass layoffs at the Center for Disease Control, which is a heavily white-collar, elite federal agency. In fact, Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, suggested in the Financial Times the other day that the European Union should be reaching out to these unemployed scientists in the United States and giving them packages so that they'll migrate to the European Union. And so many of the folks who are now being hit by the two-headed monster of Trump and Musk, they many of them voted for Trump, but they thought that the other guy was going to get laid off, not themselves. As the saying used to go in Washington, uh, do not tax me, tax that guy in front of the tree. But what happens, of course, is that they miscalculated. And the question is, are we going to be able to recover from this miscalculation? That is to say, people miscalculating perhaps where their true interests resided, that they felt that the Trump team, when seizing office, would get rid of, to go back to Ronald Wilson Reagan of the 1980s, the so-called welfare queens, the black women who were on the dole, who were taking money from the government and then buying Cadillacs and steaks. I mean, that's a very popular trope, even today in the United States, although it may not be as well articulated in
Same in Europe.
2025 as
Same in
it was
Europe
in.
with Muslims. Same in Europe with Muslims.
Mhm.
They take all the welfare and they can buy houses and cars and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And so, but then, as I said, people are being surprised. I mean, there was an article in the paper the other day about Venezuelans, many of whom were Trump adjacent, for example. They may not have been able to vote, but they were supportive of the MAGA agenda, the Make America Great Again agenda. Now they're on planes heading back to Caracas, for example. Uh, they miscalculated. I guess they thought that the Haitians would be deported, the Jamaicans would be deported, but not necessarily the Venezuelans. And so there's sort of a reverse Ponzi scheme that you can use that concept whereby you get cash from one investor to pay off another investor. In other words, you produce a segment of the population to think that that other segment of the population is going to be the ones that are besieged and hurt, and not necessarily yourselves. And obviously, we can't discuss these issues without talking about the Red Scare in this country, the anti-communism, which led to a devastation of progressive trade unions in the 1950s. Many liberals went along with this, including the trade union movement leadership, for example, which devastated labor education, which could have educated people as to what their true interests are, where their true interests reside. So it's like an Agatha Christie novel where you're trying to figure out who the culprits are. There are many culprits with regard to this crisis that the United States is now facing, and I haven't even gotten to the major crisis, which your audience should really acquaint themselves with, as Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada asserted just the other day. This idea of the United States seizing Canada is real. I mean, it is real as the nose on your face. I don't think that the Canadian elite is ready for this. I think that I was listening to Canadian broadcasting this morning, and they suggested that Canada was headed down the path of Venezuela, that it's going to be subjected to sanctions and tariffs that's going to make the economy scream. And on the one hand, of course, this is horrible news. But on the other hand, I think it opens up opportunities, hopefully, for cross border alliances. Since Canada is much more progressive than the United States, we can really use some of their progressive energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if I may jump one more time, Peter. So you talk about miscalculation of for example the white working class by voting for Trump, and I would say um, this miscalculation is just a centuries old in the sense that the white working class keeps miscalculating by voting for rich white capitalists. And I would say as a social psychologist that this has to do with this, you could almost say, symbolic capital of race. And apparently, I would think there seems to be something so appealing in race solidarity that it always seems to trump class solidarity. And the question is, what makes racial solidarity so attractive that whites keep voting against their own economic emancipation? That's, I think, one of the crucial questions to sever that kind of line, that connection between the white working class and racist voting. And so I look at it often from a more social psychological lens. You as a historian who has studied many different kind of periods in the world, what is that symbolic capital? What makes it so attractive that the white working class just does not seem to be able yet, at least on a mass scale, to bind with fellow class people that are of different racial slash ethnic backgrounds, because racism seems to be so attractive.
Well, as you know, the late great historian sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about the wages of whiteness. There's a sort of psychological wage that's being paid to make some think that they are part of a superior grouping, for example, and that materially then gives them a kind of advantage with regard to hiring and promotion, and it gives them some to look down upon and to recognize that they may not necessarily fall to that depth, to that low level. And you may know that in my book on the 16th century, and by the way, the introduction is reprinted recently in another book I just published called African Americans in the New History of the United States of America. I try to point out the religious roots of race and racism. That is to say, that if you're trying to understand the triumph of the Anglosphere, particularly in North America, in contestation with His Catholic Majesty in Spain, His Catholic Majesty was trying to use religion as a marker for society. You could be African and be a conquistador in Spanish Cuba in the 1500s, for example. But what happens is that, as you know, in 1517, Martin Luther secedes from the Catholic Church, wins over the monarch in London, leading to a round robin of ever more violent religious wars. Improvisationally, the Protestants, as they tried to gain a seat at the table of the colonial feast, recognize that for various reasons, they cannot use Protestantism as a marker of distinction and divergence. And so, improvisationally, they moved to race. Those that they had been warring with on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, then British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. You know, the list is endless. Even as I pointed out, and as others have pointed out, you didn't necessarily have to have roots in Europe if you were a Christian. Egyptian Copts, for example, Lebanese Christians like Ralph Nader, for example. And that becomes the winning ticket. And obviously, there was a so-called American dream for some. That is to say, there were a considerable number of people who got wealthy. I put out in my book on Texas, for example, that when you had the ouster of the Cherokees from what is now Georgia, the Cherokees, the indigenous grouping, they had sought to assimilate in terms of a written language, in terms of sedentary agriculture, in terms of Christianity, for example. They still had to go. And oftentimes moving into their mansions, because they were also slave owners, many of them were Europeans fresh off the boat, moving into a mansion. No wonder people celebrated the United States of America. And so, sometimes I think that the MAGA base understands the history of the United States more so than idealistic leftists. And I don't mean idealistic in a positive sense. I mean it in the sense of having a non-material analysis. put it bluntly and crudely, having a wrong-headed analysis. And so that's what we're up against, for example, because now, as I said, the United States, they want to loot and plunder Canada, for example. They want to loot and plunder Denmark and Greenland, for example. As a matter of fact, it would not surprise me at all if Mr. Trump and his minions would try to turn the tables on the entire European Union. I think that's part of the import of this meeting in Saudi Arabia this past week. Now, I'm all in favor of having a cessation of this bloody conflict in Ukraine, but one would have to be naive to ignore the bigger picture. And certainly the Europeans are panicking. They're having a collective nervous breakdown with regard to what Trump may have in store. And of course, his former national security aide, John Bolton, says in his memoir that Trump sees the European Union as second only to China as a threat to U.S. hegemony, for example. And given the fact that confronting China is more than a notion. I mean, there's an article in the current issue of the New Yorker by Dexter Filkins about how the United States military is falling apart. I mean, they're not meeting their recruiting goals. They're having to change standards, for example. And so, because they put all their money into hardware, into Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, the military-industrial complex, for example.
So they stick to DEI in the military, though. So they stick to DEI in the military.
Well, yes. Interestingly enough, they're trying to stick to DEI, but Pete Hegseth, the new Pentagon chief, who, of course, pulled the rug out from under the Ukrainians last week, he's overthrowing DEI in the military. I don't know how that's going to work, but stay tuned. I mean, obviously these people are erratic policymakers, but I say all that to say that the European Union, perhaps they're not having a collective nervous breakdown. Perhaps they're onto something if they think that they may be next on the menu for the Trump team.
Yeah, I think it was Wang Yi who just said, if you're not at the table today, something like, if you're not at the table today, it doesn't matter because tomorrow you might, even if you're at the table today, you might be on the menu tomorrow, I think is how he put it. But
I guess we are at the hour now, Professor Horne, so we're going to leave it here. That was fantastic again. We will you will definitely hear from us again in the future. If that's allowed. We have been bothering you already so many times, but that's fantastic, and we keep following you, all the updates, and have a nice evening, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you, and send me the link.
Will do.
Yeah, great talking with you.
All right.
Ditto.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.